My cruel husband kicked me out of my own house to stay with his lover. She could give me a child, so she needs to stay with me in this house, he shouted, throwing my things into the street. But he never imagined that days later, I, Mariana, would find myself alone in the garden, digging into the soil with my bare hands, almost as if that act of force and direct contact with nature allowed her to release the weight of her thoughts. It was early in the morning, and the fresh air filled her lungs while her fingers, already covered in dirt, broke down small clumps and stones. For weeks, her husband Alejandro had started behaving in ways that unsettled her. She had noticed his evasive looks, the messages he received on his phone, and, above all, those increasingly prolonged absences that he no longer bothered to justify. Mariana had tried in vain to ignore the signs, convincing herself they were just ideas in her head, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. "Are you all right, Mrs. Mariana?" asked a soft, concerned voice. She looked up and met the gaze of Julian, the young gardener who had been working at her house for a few months. There was something about him, a kind of serenity that always caught her attention. Julian, in his 20s, radiated a calm and confidence that comforted her during these uncertain times. "Yes, Julian, I'm fine," she replied with a tired smile, wiping her hands on a cloth she carried in her pocket. "I just needed a bit of distraction." Julian observed her with some doubt, noticing a sadness in her eyes that, although she tried to conceal, seemed deeply rooted in her gaze. "Well, sometimes gardening helps clear the mind," he said, gesturing to the plants around. "Would you like me to help you plant these lilies?" Mariana nodded, grateful. Julian began to dig beside her, and for a few minutes, they both immersed themselves in the work. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. Rather, it felt like a sort of truce where, for a moment, she could forget the worries that haunted her. "Julian, tell me something," she began, breaking the silence while glancing at him sideways. "Do you believe in loyalty?" "In true loyalty." Julian stopped his work and looked at her, surprised by the question. He thought for a moment before responding, "Yes, I believe in loyalty. I believe that when someone truly commits, they should be able to keep their promises. Although, of course, it's not always as easy as it seems." "What happens when someone doesn't?" Mariana lowered her gaze, struggling to contain the sadness reflected in her voice. "What happens when someone breaks that trust?" Julian looked at her with compassion. He knew that something deeper was hidden behind those words. "And I think it hurts a lot. But I also believe that loyalty isn't solely dependent on what the other person does. Sometimes it's about who we are, about who we choose to be. That's why I believe no one should carry the guilt of others' mistakes." Julian's words stayed with her. There was something so sincere in his response that, for the first time in days, Mariana felt that someone understood her. However, before she could respond, her phone rang. She looked at the screen and felt a chill upon seeing the name Carla, her husband's secretary. She took a deep breath and stepped away, answering with a firm but tense tone. "What's going on, Carla? Why are you calling so early?" The voice on the other end was cold, relentless, very different from the respectful and professional tone Carla usually used at the office. "I'm calling because I think it's time you know the truth, Mariana," Carla said bluntly. "Alejandro and I are going to have a child, and I think you should start preparing yourself because he's decided to start a new life, with or without you." Mariana felt her legs give way, and she had to lean against a nearby tree. Carla's words sank into her mind, cold and calculated, each one hitting her like a blow, leaving her breathless. Alejandro, her husband, the man she had given everything to, was going to be a father with another woman. The reality of what was happening left her paralyzed. "Why are you telling me this, Carla?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because it's fair, Mariana. Because he doesn't have the courage to tell you the truth and would rather you continue living in ignorance. But I'm tired of being the other woman." Alejandro told me he loves me and that he's willing to leave everything for us. All that's left is for you to take the next step." Carla's tone was almost triumphant, as if each word affirmed her control over the situation. Mariana felt a rage she couldn't remember feeling before. Part of her wanted to scream, cry, demand explanations. Another part wanted to remain silent and search within herself for some reason to understand the incomprehensible. She hung up without responding, feeling the phone trembling in her hand. Looking back at the garden, she noticed that Julian was watching her from a distance, concerned. His eyes reflected a mix of worry and warmth that made her feel a sense of relief. "Are you all right, Mrs. Mariana?" he asked cautiously. Mariana didn't respond immediately. She looked up at the sky, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. She knew she was at a crossroads, that this revelation forced her to decide about her life, to face the reality she had been trying to ignore. When she finally opened her eyes again, she approached Julian, trying to stay calm. "Julian, what would you do if someone betrayed you in the worst possible way?" she asked, feeling that the question was so real that she could barely hold it without breaking down. He looked at her, understanding the depth of her pain, and spoke with a softness that comforted her. "I think that, even though it would hurt, I'd try to move on because life is too short to live it trapped in the pain others cause." "I'm not saying it's easy, but sometimes someone's betrayal forces us to find a strength in ourselves we didn't know we had." Mariana looked at him in silence, feeling a strange peace in his words. It was as if this simple moment in the garden was reminding her that, although her world had collapsed, there were still parts of her that could be rebuilt. That night, while immersed in her thoughts in the garden under the moonlight, she realized that her life was at a breaking point. Alejandro had made his decisions, and those decisions did not include Mariana nor respect the love they once shared. She felt broken, humiliated, but also, somewhere deep down, a spark of courage was reborn. With her eyes fixed on the stars, Mariana made a promise to herself. She wouldn't let pain dictate the course of her life. Perhaps fate had left her alone in that garden at that moment, but she knew she wasn't truly alone. There, among the plants, in the space created by her own hands, and in Julian's honest presence, she found a small but significant glimmer of hope. Mariana stood up, leaving behind the weight of the conversation with Carla, and headed into the house with a new determination, ready to face the decisions that awaited her. The next day, Mariana woke up with the first light of dawn, her body still carrying the tension left by Carla's call the previous day. Beside her, the bed was still empty. Alejandro hadn't returned home, and instead of feeling relief, the emptiness next to her only reminded her that the life she thought she had was just a facade. She knew she had to make decisions, but she didn't feel ready to face the reality of her marriage. So she did the only thing that gave her some peace. She went to the garden. The dew still covered the leaves, and a gentle breeze refreshed the air as the sun began to warm the morning. Soon after, Julian appeared. He seemed a bit surprised to see her so early, but he also understood that something in her had changed. "Good morning, Mrs. Mariana," he said in a gentle tone, trying to read her mood on her face. "Good morning, Julian. You can just call me Mariana," she replied, not taking her eyes off the plants. Julian smiled slightly, nodding. Something in her demeanor was new, different. There was a quietness in her, but also a latent sadness that concerned him. "Would you like me to bring you a cup of tea? Maybe it would help you relax," Julian suggested, without pressing but with a kindness that touched Mariana. "And thank you." "Yes, that would be nice," she responded, offering a faint smile as he went to the kitchen. Mariana sat on the bench under the shade of a tree and closed her eyes, letting herself be enveloped by the silence of the garden. When Julian returned with the cup of tea, she looked at him with gratitude, took a sip, enjoying the warmth that spread from her hands to her chest, and decided to share a bit of what she felt. "I got a call yesterday," she said, choosing her words carefully. A call that changed many things. Julian looked at her, listening attentively without interrupting. The woman who works with Alejandro called me and said they're going to have a child, and he no longer has plans to stay with me. Her voice broke as she said those last words, and Julian felt a deep pain for her. He had seen her deal with doubts and suspicions in silence, but now he saw her sadness tangibly, a sadness that seemed to sink her into bitter loneliness. "I'm really sorry, Mariana," he said sincerely. "I don't know what to say, but I'm here. You shouldn't have to go through this alone." Mariana looked at him, trying to find comfort in his presence. "The worst part is that a part of me suspected it. I kept telling myself that I was paranoid, that it was my imagination, but here I am, facing the truth, and I don't know what to do." Julian sat beside her, not invading her space, but offering his support. "And I think that sometimes the first step is accepting that not everything is in our hands. He may have made his choice, but that doesn't mean you don't have yours, Mariana." She looked at him, processing his words. There was something powerful in what he was saying, something that returned a bit of her own strength. For the first time, she considered that her life could continue without Alejandro, that she could build something of her own, something that didn't depend on anyone else's decisions. "I don't know if I'm ready to face what's coming," she admitted. "I've spent so much time trying to keep this life, being the perfect wife, building something stable, and now I feel like it's all been a lie." Julian looked at her with a sincerity he rarely dared to show. Sometimes, keeping up the facade makes us forget who we really are. Maybe this is the moment to discover that, to let the real Mariana emerge, without fear of what others might think. Mariana let out a deep sigh, feeling that those words touched something deep within her. She had never thought of herself outside the role of wife. She had always been the woman beside Alejandro, supporting his decisions and covering the household responsibilities. But who is she really without that role? The conversation with Julian planted a seed of introspection in her mind, and throughout the week, she began taking small steps toward her independence. She started taking charge of decisions she had previously delegated, spending more time for herself, even calling old friends she had lost touch with. Each small act of autonomy made her feel that she was reconnecting with a part of herself that had been forgotten. However, one afternoon, Alejandro appeared at the house with his usual haughty posture and an expression Mariana couldn't decipher. He approached, noticing that she was waiting for him in the garden, and for a moment, they both remained in silence, observing each other from a distance. "I want to talk to you," Alejandro finally said, his voice sounding cold, almost indifferent. Mariana nodded and invited him to sit on the bench. Julian, who was pruning the plants a few meters away, sensed the tension and decided to move a bit further away, giving them some privacy, although he kept a watchful eye on the scene. "What do you need to say to me, Alejandro?" Mariana asked, trying to remain calm, although she felt her heart racing. Alejandro looked at her with a mix of irritation and arrogance. "Carla told me she talked to you. I didn't agree with her doing it, but I think I have no other choice but to be direct. Things have changed, Mariana. Carla and I are going to have a child, and I think the best thing for everyone is that we separate." The coldness of his words hit her, but Mariana remained firm. It was as if, after days of processing everything, she could finally see Alejandro clearly, without the veil of idealization she once had. "Is that really what you want, Alejandro? To leave me after all this time, after having built a life together?" she asked, her voice full of dignity. He nodded without hesitation. "Yes, I think it's for the best. There's no point in staying together if we no longer share the same goals. Carla and I, well, we're in a new phase, and I want you to be free to rebuild your life." Mariana watched him in silence, evaluating each word, each gesture. In that moment, she understood that what once was love had become nothing more than an empty shadow. Alejandro was determined to leave and owed her no more explanations than he had already given. "Very well, Alejandro," she finally said with a calm that surprised even herself. "If that's what you want, I won't stop you. But I want you to know that, even if you choose this path, I will not be destroyed by it." Alejandro seemed uncomfortable with her response, as if he had expected a different reaction. However, he didn't try to argue further, and after a few seconds of silence, he stood up to leave. Julian, who had been watching from a distance, approached as soon as Alejandro disappeared. Seeing him, Mariana felt an unexpected peace. She knew there was much to resolve, that the pain was still there, but she also understood that there was something stronger than betrayal, her own capacity to rebuild. "Are you okay?" Julian asked, his voice soft and supportive. "Yes, Julian, I think I am," Mariana replied, nodding as a faint smile began to form on her face. "Today, for the first time, I feel like I can say that I'm at peace." Julian looked at her, his respect and admiration evident. The woman standing before him was no longer the same as the one he had met at first. She was someone stronger, someone who had found within herself the ability to move forward. And at that moment, they both felt that, although life had become complicated, they had reached a moment of mutual understanding and hope. The next day, Mariana was sitting in the dining room, staring at the cup of cold coffee in front of her. The conversation with Alejandro the day before still resonated in her mind, each word still fresh, still piercing. Despite everything, she had found within herself a calm she had never thought possible. She was ready to face any decision he would make, or at least she thought so, until she heard the sound of the door and saw Alejandro enter with a determined and cold expression. He looked at her in silence for a moment, as if carefully choosing his words. Mariana felt a knot in her stomach. Something in his gaze told her that this conversation would be even more difficult than she had anticipated. "Mariana, we need to talk about something important," Alejandro said, his tone dry and authoritative, as if there was no longer any trace of the closeness they once shared. "Tell me, Alejandro," she responded, keeping calm, though her heart was racing. Alejandro sat down across from her and cleared his throat, avoiding her gaze for a moment. "I've been thinking about all of this, about how we should proceed with our separation. There's no point in continuing to avoid the inevitable," Alejandro began, while Mariana watched him in silence, waiting for him to continue, though her whole body seemed to anticipate the blow that was about to come. "Carla and I need a space to start our family," he continued, without any hint of doubt in his voice. "We've decided that it would be better if you're the one to leave the house. This property is large. It has the perfect garden for the child to grow up, to have space and freedom. I've thought about it a lot, but I believe it's the most reasonable thing." Alejandro's words hit her like stones. He was throwing her out of her own home, the life they had built together, just because he had decided to start a new family. Mariana felt that each word drove a thorn into her heart. However, she remained firm, not allowing him to see the pain he was causing her. "Are you saying I have to leave my own house?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, laden with disbelief. Alejandro nodded, as if it were the most logical and natural decision. "And it's not just your house, Mariana. We built it together, and now my needs are different. Carla and the baby need a spacious and comfortable place. I think it's best for everyone. I'm willing to give you the support you need so you can find another place, a place that suits your new life." Mariana looked at him with a mixture of sadness and surprise. For years, she had shared her dreams and goals with him, and now he was pushing her out, without hesitation, without any remorse. The indifference with which Alejandro spoke about her future and the life she would leave behind was incomprehensible to her. "Alejandro, this place has memories. It's part of me," she said, trying to control her voice, which trembled from the mix of emotions. "Do you really disregard everything we've lived through here?" He looked at her without the slightest trace of empathy, and his next words were cold and cutting. "Memories aren't enough, Mariana. I need something real, a future. Carla and I are going to be parents, and I want to give my child the best. Mariana took a deep breath, feeling how each of his words pushed her further away from the image of the man she had once dreamed of sharing her life with. But behind the pain, something began to awaken in her, a silent strength, a conviction that she wouldn't allow him to take everything from her without a fight. I understand your priorities, Alejandro, she replied with a calmness that surprised him. But if you've decided to move forward, then go. I will find my own path, and don't worry about me, because I assure you that, no matter where I go, I'll carry something with me that you will never be able to take back. He frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the firmness in Mariana's voice. He hadn't expected her to respond that way, to hold her head high and speak with a dignity that disarmed him. For an instant, Alejandro seemed to hesitate, but his pride stopped him. He stood up, took a step back, and looked at her as if to finalize the conversation. I hope you make a decision soon, Mariana. This change will be for the best for everyone. Without saying another word, Alejandro left the room, leaving her in silence, immersed in a mix of emotions ranging from pain to indignation. Mariana felt the tears start to form in her eyes, but she held them back. She wasn't going to give Alejandro the power to see her broken, not when he had made decisions that pushed her to find a new life. After a few moments of stillness, Mariana decided to go out to the garden, the only place that brought her any peace. Julian, as if sensing her need for his presence, appeared from behind a hedge and approached her with his usual calm demeanor. Is everything all right, Mariana? He asked, noticing the sadness in her eyes. Mariana tried to smile, though her lips barely moved. Alejandro asked me to leave the house, she finally said, the words ringing with a mix of disbelief and resignation. He wants me to be the one to go, so he can live here with Carla and their child. Julian looked at her in silence for a moment, processing the harshness of that confession. His face reflected a mixture of surprise and disgust. He himself couldn't understand how someone who had shared a life with Mariana could treat her that way. Mariana, I don't know what to say, but you don't deserve this, especially not from someone who once claimed to love you, Julian said, his words full of compassion and sincerity. No one deserves to be treated like they're disposable. Mariana looked at him, feeling understood in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. Julian's sincerity was comforting, and for the first time, she allowed herself to release her emotions, letting her tears fall in silence. Julian moved a little closer, placing a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of support that she received with gratitude. I don't know what I'll do, Julian. I never imagined it would come to this, she confessed through tears. I dedicated my life to this house, to this marriage, and now it feels like it was all in vain. Nothing has been in vain, Mariana, Julian replied firmly. Everything you've done here, every effort and every sacrifice speaks of who you are, not of him. This house may be a place you leave behind, but what you carry within you, what you've built in your heart, that is yours forever. Mariana looked at him, surprised by the depth of his words. She felt an indescribable warmth, a kind of hope beginning to emerge from the ashes of her sadness. It was true, she had dedicated her life to something she believed was eternal, but that value, that dedication, were still hers. And that was something Alejandro couldn't take from her. Thank you, Julian. You don't know how much it means to me to hear you say that, Mariana said, her voice still trembling but with a renewed firmness. Julian smiled slightly, and although he said nothing more, his presence brought her a tranquility that allowed her to breathe more freely. They both remained in the garden in silence, sharing a moment that for Mariana was more than mere comfort. It was a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, there was light and strength within her. As evening fell, while she looked out at the garden from the window, Mariana understood that the time for staying in the past was over. Alejandro had made his decision, and although she didn't understand it, she also wasn't willing to hold on to someone who didn't value what they had. That day, Mariana made a silent but powerful decision. She would move forward, find a new place, and reinvent herself. She knew the path would be difficult, but she also knew that, for the first time in a long time, she had the opportunity to live for herself. She spent the next few days in a mixture of pain and determination. Although she still felt the weight of Alejandro's words, she also knew she wasn't willing to give up so easily. The idea of leaving her home, the life she had built with so much effort, felt bearable. The house and the garden weren't just bricks and plants. They were the reflection of years of sacrifices and dreams, of laughter and also of tears. It was during one of those sleepless nights, while going through old documents, that a memory came to her mind. When she married Alejandro and she had signed a prenuptial agreement. Something that, at the time, seemed unnecessary, but that she had accepted at her family's insistence. In that agreement, it was stipulated that, in the event of infidelity, the person who broke the promise of fidelity would be the one to leave the family home. Remembering this, Mariana felt a spark of hope, something she had believed lost until that moment. If Alejandro had been unfaithful, he was the one who had to leave. Mariana decided it was time to defend what was hers, not out of whim, but because it was the right thing to do. The next day, she made an appointment with a lawyer. He was a mature man, with a calm voice and an observant gaze. When she arrived at his office, he greeted her kindly, inviting her to sit and listening attentively as she explained the situation. So, you're saying there's a prenuptial agreement that states that, in the event of infidelity, the responsible party must leave the marital home. Is that correct? The lawyer asked with a calm voice. Yes, that's correct, Mariana replied. I always thought it was something symbolic, that I'd never have to use it, but now Alejandro has asked me to leave so he can live here with his lover and their child, and I don't think that's fair. The lawyer nodded, taking notes as he listened to her. After a few moments of reflection, he looked at her with a sympathetic expression. The first thing I should tell you, Mariana, is that the prenuptial agreement is completely valid. If Alejandro has been unfaithful, he must comply with what you both signed. The problem is, to enforce this clause, we'll need to prove the infidelity. Do you have any evidence of what you've told me? Mariana felt a slight chill. Although she knew about Alejandro's relationship with Carla, it had all been through her own confession. There were no physical proofs, nothing she could immediately present. Well, it was Alejandro's secretary, Carla, who called me to tell me they're expecting a child, Mariana explained, lowering her gaze. Although I don't have physical proof, I know it's true. I don't think she'd lie about something like that. The lawyer nodded, assessing the situation. We could request additional evidence, Mariana. There is a possibility of verifying the infidelity through a private investigation. Although it's not simple, it can be done. Of course, it's not mandatory. If he decides to confess, we could ask him to declare it voluntarily, and if he admits the relationship, he would have to comply with the agreement. Mariana felt that, for the first time in weeks, she had a semblance of control over the situation. She wasn't completely at his mercy. Her determination grew stronger as she realized she could fight for her home. Let's do it, she said, her voice firm and determined. I'm not going to let him keep the house, not after everything I've been through. I want to do this the right way. The lawyer smiled slightly, admiring her strength. Very well, Mariana. I'll prepare the necessary documentation. We'll do everything possible to ensure this situation is resolved in the fairest way. In the days that followed, Mariana began to move with renewed determination. Returning home, she saw Julian working in the garden. Without thinking twice, she approached him. The calm of his presence remained a refuge for her, someone with whom she felt she could share her thoughts without fear of being judged. I'm going to meet with a lawyer, she said as she sat on the bench, watching him work. Julian looked up, surprised by the change in her tone. There was something different about her, a kind of confidence he hadn't seen before. So, how did it go? He asked, setting down the shovel and moving closer to hear her better. Well, I remembered that Alejandro and I signed an agreement. If either of us was unfaithful, that person would have to leave the house. The lawyer explained that I can enforce it, but I need evidence for it to hold. Julian smiled slightly, admiring the strength she was finding within herself. I'm glad to hear that, Mariana. I think it's time he took responsibility for his decisions. You've spent too much time letting him decide everything, and now you're taking control of your life. She nodded, feeling the weight of his words and understanding that, although the process would be difficult, she was no longer willing to remain silent. That same day, Alejandro arrived home and found her waiting in the dining room, ready to face the next conversation. Alejandro, I want to talk to you, she said as soon as he entered, with a calm but firm tone. He looked at her, surprised by her demeanor, and approached slowly, still maintaining that distant posture that had hurt her so much. What's going on, Mariana? He asked, though there was a hint of impatience in his voice. I've been reviewing our prenuptial agreement, she began, without looking away. According to what we signed, whoever was unfaithful must leave the marital home. You broke our promise, Alejandro. And that means it's you who has to leave the house. Alejandro looked at her incredulously and then let out a bitter laugh. Do you really think I'm going to do that, Mariana? This is as much my home as it is yours. Besides, you can't prove anything. All you have is Carla's word, and that's not enough to kick me out of here. Mariana, however, did not back down. She knew Alejandro wasn't going to accept the situation so easily, but she had anticipated his reaction. I've already spoken to a lawyer, Alejandro. If you insist on staying, we'll go to court, and I assure you I'll do whatever it takes to prove your infidelity. I'm not leaving my home without a fight. This place isn't just property, it's my life, and I won't let you take it that easily. He looked at her in silence, weighing her words with a mix of surprise and restrained anger. He hadn't expected Mariana to defend herself so firmly, and his pride wouldn't let him yield. So now you think you're a warrior, Mariana, he responded with an ironic smile. Very well, if you want to do this, we'll do this. But remember, whatever happens, you're losing too. Mariana held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. Maybe, but at least this time, I'll be at peace with myself because I know I fought for what was mine. I'm not afraid, Alejandro. If you choose to stay here, I assure you will make this as difficult as possible. Alejandro rose from the chair, visibly irritated, and left the room. But despite his apparent resolve, Mariana noticed that her words had affected him. She had spoken with a conviction he hadn't anticipated. And although she didn't know how this battle would end, she felt she was finally taking control of her life. That night, Mariana sat in the garden, breathing deeply, feeling how each step in her defense brought back a part of herself she had forgotten. Julian appeared shortly after and, seeing her, offered her a smile. Looks like someone has found her strength, he said with a tone that mixed admiration and understanding. Mariana looked at him, giving a grateful smile. Thank you, Julian. Sometimes I feel that, without your support, I wouldn't have had the courage to face all this. He shook his head, moving a little closer. All that strength was always within you, Mariana. You just needed to remember it. They both remained silent, gazing at the garden under the moonlight. Mariana knew that, though the situation was difficult, she had begun to heal, to free herself from a relationship that had left her empty. She felt that her life, after so long, finally belonged to her. The days following the confrontation with Alejandro were intense for Mariana. For the first time in years, she felt alive, filled with a strength she had never known before. Each day that passed, each step she took in defense of her home, reminded her that she had a right to her own life, a life free from the shadows of betrayal. Her lawyer informed her that the legal process to enforce the prenuptial agreement had begun. Alejandro, predictably, had hired his own team of lawyers and was determined to make the process as difficult as possible. The tension between them grew, and their interactions were reduced to cold calls and harsh words. Mariana found refuge in the garden, in the long days and calm nights, and there was always Julian, silent but present, offering his company and support when she needed it most. Although their connection grew stronger, they both kept a respectful distance, knowing that Mariana was in the midst of a process of healing and personal struggle. One afternoon, while Mariana was planting new flowers along the garden border, Julian approached with a serious expression. "Mariana, there's something I've wanted to tell you for a while," he began, taking a deep breath. "I want you to know that I'm here, no matter what. If you need anything, if you ever feel overwhelmed, don't hesitate to reach out to me." Mariana looked at him, touched by the sincerity in his words. "Thank you, Julian. You have been an invaluable support to me. Sometimes I feel like you're the only person who truly understands what I'm going through." Julian smiled softly and moved a little closer, looking into her eyes. "It's impossible not to understand you, Mariana. What you've been through, what you're going through, is proof of your strength. You are so much more than you realize." Mariana felt those words sink deep into her heart. It was as if Julian could see something in her that even she hadn't fully acknowledged. For the first time in a long time, she felt she wasn't alone, that someone truly saw and valued her. "It makes me feel," she began, but paused, unable to find the right words. "It makes me feel like I can handle this." "And you can," he replied without hesitation. "You don't need anyone to give you strength, Mariana. You just need to remember who you are and what you're worth." The connection between them was palpable, but Julian maintained respect and distance. They both knew that it wasn't the time for more. Their relationship needed to remain a source of support and respect, not an emotional distraction. That same evening, when Alejandro arrived home, he found a different Mariana. There was a confidence in her that he didn't recall seeing before, a presence that unsettled him. He knew her decision to stay in the house was a challenge, a kind of declaration of war, and Alejandro was not willing to back down. "So, you're really set on staying?" he asked, with a mix of disbelief and annoyance. "Yes, Alejandro. This is my home just as much as it's yours." "I did nothing to lose my right to be here," she responded, looking him in the eye. Alejandro observed her, noticing this change that unsettled him. His cold gaze tried to intimidate her, but Mariana was no longer the same woman he had controlled for years. "Mariana, I don't think you understand what you're risking. I could make your life unbearable. You could end up losing in this process. I don't know why you keep holding on to something that no longer makes sense," Alejandro said, trying to destabilize her. Mariana listened in silence, weighing each word. It was clear that he still believed he had power over her, that he still saw her as someone vulnerable, unable to face the consequences. "I'm not clinging to anything, Alejandro. I'm just defending what is rightfully mine, what we built together," she said, her tone firm and assured. "If you decided to break that commitment, then it's you who has to face the consequences. I won't be the one to run from my own life." Alejandro let out a bitter laugh, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Do you really think you can come out of this unscathed?" he asked, attempting to destabilize her. "I don't know, but I'm willing to find out," she replied without hesitation. "Maybe I'll get hurt, but at least I'll come out with my dignity intact, something you lost a long time ago." Alejandro looked at her, stunned by the bluntness of her words. He had never seen Mariana speak with such honesty, such firmness, and for a moment, he seemed thrown off. "You know, Mariana, you're making a mistake," he said finally, his voice cold and calculating. "You won't always have someone to support you. Julian won't be there for you when this is over. Remember, he's just an employee." Mariana felt a pang at his words, but she didn't let Alejandro see her reaction. "Julian has been more loyal to me than you have been in years," she said with a calm that disarmed him. "And I don't need his support or anyone else's to face this. Don't be mistaken, Alejandro. I'm here for myself and no one else." The coldness in her response made Alejandro realize that the woman in front of him was no longer the same. Without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving her alone, but with a strange sense of victory. Each conversation with him reinforced her decision, reminding her why she was fighting. That night, as she looked at the stars from the garden, she felt an inner peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if, little by little, she was reclaiming every fragment of her identity, every corner of herself that had been buried in her marriage. Julian appeared as if sensing she needed company. "How are you?" he asked with that softness that always comforted her. "I'm fine, Julian, truly. I think for the first time in a long time, I know what I want," she replied with a small smile. Julian looked at her, visibly moved to see the strength in her words. "You've always known, Mariana. You just needed to give yourself permission to believe in yourself." She nodded, letting the garden's tranquility and Julian's presence fill the empty space Alejandro had left in her life. She was no longer a woman afraid of loss. She was someone who had decided to win. Even if the battle was hard, she knew the path wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that, no matter what, she would move forward, because now she had something that neither Alejandro nor anyone else could take away, her own strength and self-respect. Mariana woke up at dawn with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Instead of staying in bed, she went out into the garden barefoot, feeling the fresh dew beneath her feet. The air was full of life, and the sun began to light up the space she loved so much. That garden was more than a refuge. It was her place of healing, the only place where she felt truly free. That morning, like so many others, she found Julian. He was checking the plants with a quiet concentration that always made her smile. Noticing her presence, Julian looked up and offered her a warm smile. "Good morning, Mariana," he said with his usual calm tone. "Good morning, Julian. Today really is a good day," she replied with renewed energy. He nodded, noticing the sparkle in her eyes. The woman he saw in front of him was completely different from the one he had met months ago. Now there was a strength in her that resonated in every gesture, in every word, and seeing this transformation filled him with admiration. "How are things going with the lawyer?" Julian asked, stepping a little closer. Mariana sighed and looked at the sky before answering, "Still in progress. Alejandro keeps fighting, and his lawyers are making things difficult, as expected, but it doesn't worry me as much anymore. I know that, whatever happens, I'll move forward. I'm ready to accept whatever comes," she said with a firmness that reflected her growth. Julian remained silent for a moment, admiring her, then lowered his gaze with a slight nervousness Mariana had never noticed in him before. "Mariana, there's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time, but I haven't found the right moment," he began, hesitating a little. She looked at him with curiosity, surprised by the tone of his voice. "What is it, Julian?" "You've given me so much without realizing it," he said finally, finding the words. "I've seen your struggle, your courage to face all of this, watching you reclaim your life, find yourself again. It has inspired me, and not only that, Mariana, I feel something deep for you. I know it's inappropriate, I know you have a lot to think about, and the last thing you need is this, but I can't stay silent anymore." Mariana remained silent, watching him, and felt her heart pounding. There was something in his words that stirred complex emotions within her, a mix of surprise and tenderness. For a long time, Julian had been her unwavering support, her refuge in the darkest moments. And though she hadn't recognized it until now, a part of her heart also felt drawn to him. "Julian," she murmured, unsure of where to begin, "you have no idea how much it means to me to hear that." He nodded, respectful and without pressure. He knew his words might have taken her by surprise and didn't want her to feel any obligation. "I'm not asking for anything, Mariana. I just needed you to know. I'll be here for you in whatever you decide and the path you choose, unconditionally." Mariana felt tears of gratitude welling up. There was something so sincere and pure in him that touched her deeply. "Julian, you are the only one who has shown me what true respect, true loyalty is," she said, taking a breath before continuing. "I don't know what will happen in my life now, but I want you to know that you'll always have a place in my heart." He smiled tenderly, and they both sat in silence, enjoying the peace of that shared moment. Mariana didn't feel pressured. On the contrary, she felt accepted, understood, and it gave her a serenity she had never experienced. That moment was interrupted by the sound of her phone. Mariana picked it up and saw it was a call from her lawyer. She sighed, preparing to hear whatever news he had, and answered. "Good morning, Mariana. I wanted to inform you that we managed to schedule a final meeting with Alejandro's lawyers to reach an agreement. It will be in a few days. I think we are close to a resolution," her lawyer informed her. "Thank you, counselor. I'll be ready for whatever is needed," she replied, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. She hung up and looked at Julian, who watched her with a calm expression. "What did they say?" he asked, interested. "It seems we're close to an agreement. I'll meet with Alejandro and his lawyers in a few days. Maybe this nightmare will finally end," she replied, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Julian nodded, offering her an encouraging smile. "I trust everything will turn out well, Mariana. No matter what happens, you've already won something more important than this house. You've reclaimed yourself." Mariana looked at him gratefully, knowing he was right, that the real victory was in finding herself amid the storm. At that moment, she felt she could face anything. Days later, the time for the meeting arrived. Mariana entered her lawyer's office with her head held high, ready to see Alejandro and settle the terms of their separation once and for all. When she arrived, Alejandro was already there, his expression reflecting a mix of impatience and displeasure. They both took their seats across from their respective lawyers. Alejandro's lawyer spoke first, explaining the terms they proposed for the agreement. He tried to soften the demands, but ultimately, the proposal was the same. Mariana had to hand over the house to Alejandro and leave. Alejandro's face reflected satisfaction as he listened to his lawyer, convinced he would get his way. However, Mariana didn't waver. She looked at her lawyer and nodded for him to speak. "My client is not willing to hand over the property," Mariana's lawyer said firmly. "The prenuptial agreement stipulates that, in case of infidelity, the responsible party must leave the marital home. Alejandro broke that commitment, and my client is ready to fight to ensure the agreement they both signed is honored." Alejandro frowned, irritated by Mariana's resolve. "Are you really going to make this so difficult, Mariana?" he asked, his tone dismissive. She looked at him with a calmness that reflected her determination. "Alejandro, you are the one who broke our vows. If that's not enough reason to leave this house, then you're showing that only material things matter to you, not respect or the commitments we once made," she responded, her voice echoing through the room. Alejandro's lawyer tried to ease the situation, suggesting that they both consider a temporary cohabitation agreement. But Mariana wasn't willing to yield. "I've fought too hard to stop halfway. I won't leave my home," she affirmed with a firmness that everyone in the room could feel. Finally, after hours of deliberation and arguments, Alejandro and his lawyers agreed that he would leave the house and transfer ownership to Mariana. When Alejandro signed the agreement, he looked at her with a mixture of anger and frustration, but she only responded with a calm and confident gaze. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Alejandro," she said without a trace of bitterness, only with a dignity he had never understood. As she left the office, Mariana felt an immense weight lift off her shoulders. It hadn't been easy, but she had finally succeeded. That house, the place that symbolized years of struggle and sacrifice, would remain her home. More than ever, she felt that place belonged to her in body and soul. That night, when she returned home, she found Julian in the garden, as always, working silently. Upon seeing her, He approached and, without saying a word, embraced her. There were no words, only the silence of a shared moment, a moment that symbolized the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For the first time, Mariana felt truly free. A year had passed since that day when Mariana won the case and reclaimed her home. During that time, her life had changed profoundly, more than she had ever imagined possible. She was no longer the woman who, with fear and pain, had faced a devastating betrayal. Now she felt free, whole, and with a clarity that allowed her to look to the future with hope. From the moment Alejandro left the house, Mariana decided not to look back. She focused on healing, on rebuilding her life from the ground up, and surrounding herself with things and people that genuinely brought her peace and happiness. Julian, who had been her unconditional support from the beginning, remained by her side. Their relationship evolved naturally, transforming from a sincere friendship into a deep and genuine love. One summer afternoon, while they both enjoyed a quiet moment in the garden, Julian watched her in silence, noticing the serenity on her face. "Mariana, did you ever imagine life would bring you here?" he asked with a gentle smile. She turned to him, took his hand, and interlaced her fingers with his. "No, I never imagined it," she replied, sincere. "I spent so many years of my life in a relationship that I thought was solid, but it was empty. Yet this past year with you has been the time when I truly learned how to be happy." Julian looked at her, moved, and gently caressed her face. He understood what those words meant to her, how much she had fought to leave behind the pain and distrust that had marked her in the past. "You know, Julian, you didn't just give me hope back. You made me feel like I'd never felt with anyone before. So many years, but I never felt as loved or respected as I do with you," she said, looking at him tenderly. "You're not just someone who cares for me and values me. You're a man who makes me feel whole, both in my life and in my heart." Julian smiled and looked at her with the respect and admiration he had always shown her. "For me, being by your side is a privilege, Mariana. I love every part of you, every moment we share. You are an incredible woman, and what we have is something I've always wanted to give you, a love that is sincere and without conditions." Mariana hugged him, feeling that she had found not just a companion, but someone who truly understood and accepted her in her entirety. Over the past year, she had discovered that her relationship with Julian went far beyond the physical. In him, there was a sensitivity and kindness that made her feel safe and valued, both in moments of intimacy and in each shared day. They loved each other in every way, in body and soul, and it was the emotional and spiritual connection that made their love so deep and lasting. With him, Mariana had experienced what it meant to be completely appreciated and cared for. Julian was a man who, beyond any external trait, offered her a love that was genuine, selfless, and constant. That summer, surrounded by the flowers they had planted together and in the peace of their home, Mariana realized that her life had found new meaning. Beside her was Julian, a man who had not only healed the wounds of her past, but reminded her every day of how valuable and loved she was. Mariana took a moment to reflect, looking at Julian and feeling infinite gratitude. "Thank you, Julian, for showing me what love truly means. Thank you for making me feel alive and, above all, for giving me back to myself. You are the love I never knew I needed, and every day with you is a gift I will never take for granted." Julian embraced her tightly, and in that embrace, Mariana felt all the love and respect he offered her. There was a man who showed her, in every gesture, in every word, that true love demands nothing, rushes nothing. It simply is. With Julian by her side, Mariana understood that after all the pain and struggle, the love that truly matters is the one that helps us grow, respects and values us, and accepts us fully. In that garden, under the summer sun, Mariana and Julian promised to move forward together, loving and caring for each other in this new chapter of their lives. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And if you've experienced a similar betrayal, please share your valuable opinion. I'd be honored if you'd give this video a like, share it with a friend or family member, and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss the next surprising story appearing on your screen now. We've got guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video.